Hey watch friends, today we're going to check out the latest offering from the Irish micro brand Martin Design, and this is the Connemara. This one's going to be launching on Kickstarter. The exact date is not yet announced, but it's expected to be the second week of April 2025, tentatively around April 8th. I'll of course have a link down in the video description to that campaign. I do want to mention up front, this one we're looking at today is a very early prototype. The reason why that's important to note is there are going to be finishing improvements as well as a number of updates, and I'll try to highlight those as we go throughout. Additionally, in case you saw that banner, they do intend to send me a production version, and I always of course want to be upfront about that. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive straight in. We'll knock out the specs, we'll talk about the updates, all those kind of pieces, get a better feel for what it's like to live with, and then wrap things up. First, as far as the dimensions, the case measured from the 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock position is coming in dead on at 40 millimeters. The bezel is virtually flush. I get on that outer lip 39.8 millimeters. The lugs are a strap change friendly 20 millimeters. The lug to lug is definitely very much on the long side. This is coming in at 49.7 millimeters. So I'll give a spoiler right there. It's not the most small wrist friendly, though you'll see it on my 6.5 inch wrist to get an idea there. As far as the thickness, the total thickness on this is coming in at 13.2 millimeters. That is inclusive of the crystal. Definitely a little bit on the chunky side, but we'll unpack that further. As far as the crystal itself, it's hard to see, but it is very subtly domed. So it is technically a domed crystal there. It is a sapphire crystal, and on the production version, it will feature inner AR. On this early prototype, it does not have AR coating, so do note you might get a little more glare, though I tried to minimize it as much as possible. The movement is one that's a first for me. This is actually the PTS S05B is the specific movement for this one. So for those who are not familiar, we'll knock out some of the basic specs for it. It is an automatic, as we'll check out here, but additionally though, it does have hand winding, so you can wind from the crown. It does not have hacking, however, with a small second. I don't really think that's that big of a deal. It is a lower beat at 21,600 beats per hour, but again, with small second, I don't think it's that noticeable. And then the power reserve is definitely one of the shorter ones that I've experienced at 32 hours stated power reserve. So this is one, expect that you're either going to wear or wind on a daily basis if you want to keep it running. Plus, of course, you can throw it in a watch winder or what have you if you are so inclined. As far as the water resistance, this is coming in at 50 meters or 5 atmospheres. That is definitely on the lower side for an everyday watch, but this styling, I think that's plenty fine. And then the weight, there are actually two different options. So this comes standard on this strap that you see here, and that is coming in at 84.7 grams. But additionally though, there is going to be an optional bracelet. And if you put it on this one, size to my 6.5 inch wrist, you're looking at 138.2 grams. So really not too bad there either. All right, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive deeper and get a better feel for the actual model. This is initially going to be launching with 3 different color variants. However, there are going to be different sub-dial choices, so technically speaking, you're actually going to have 6 variants. There's the black that we're looking at today. There's additionally a silver version, as well as a blue version, and then again with different color combinations there as far as the sub-dials. One of the things that you're going to notice beyond obviously the open heart that we'll come back to is each of these have a very pronounced horizontal brushing. So that's running from the 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock direction. While I call this a horizontal brushing, it actually to me is more reminiscent of like a carve kind of texture for that, where it's just like milled or etched down into it. It reminds me almost of like a just linear guilloche for it, because it really has a lot more depth than you would typically have for brushing. Why is that important to note there? On this black version, I think it actually gives almost like a vinyl record effect, and that's really cool. But additionally though, I think as you see this moving across different lighting conditions, you're going to notice it picks up more light play, though it's a different light play than you would typically get from like a sunburst with a traditional brush pattern for that. As far as the dial layout, these are all going to have the same basic layout. The main things you're going to notice is, of course, that this is an asymmetrical design. So as opposed to being the primary watch face as the full dial, really your dial is going to be at the 3 o'clock position with those sub-dials, and then the rest of it is just aesthetic aspects, which is similar to the Supernatural we looked at previously, though of course a very different layout and execution. As far as the finishes, this really mixes up across it. So we already talked about that carving or that etching that you have in there, but then additionally, as you move to the sub-dials, you can see it picks up some of like a satin kind of texture. Then as you move into the interior of that primary sub-dial, you can see it has like a pebble or a sand kind of texture. I'd call it more of a sand than a pebble there. At the 12 o'clock position, you can see that this does have the Martin Design applied logo, again, similar to what we've seen in the past. And then at the 6 o'clock position on the primary sub-dial, you can see that it does have the model name. Do note on the production version, they are going to increase the size of that a little bit. Shifting over to the main thing that you're going to readily notice on this is the open heart. And this is not just any open heart. I, in fact, am not generally a fan of open hearts, but this one I have found to be really cool. This is actually featuring dual balance wheels, as you can see. So you get dual wheels kind of competing against each other and really trying to vie for your attention as you're trying to check the time. At the 3 o'clock position, you're pulling over to the 9 o'clock with your eyes. And then around that, you can see that this does have screw accents, which obviously have a functional purpose for those. But additionally, I think they add some visual interest for that as well. Just gives somewhat of that like elegant industrial look for this. As far as the hardware on this is a polished handset. As you can see, you're going to be looking at very small hands. So focusing first on the primary dial, that's where your hour and minute hand are going to be. Those are not only polished, but these particular ones are actually blued as well. So as the light hits it, for those who are not familiar with blued, sometimes it's going to look black with reflections and otherwise, but when you get the light hitting it just right, it picks with that vibrant heat blued kind of coloration for that. So that's really cool there. These are skeletonized, and they're what I would describe as kind of like a lance tip or what have you, or a spear for those. Shifting over to the second sub-dial, which is going to be that small one there, you can see that this has what I'm going to call a little dagger. So it's kind of like a embellished like floral for the actual handset, actual hand rather. But I would call it kind of like a little mini dagger with that tiny execution of that. So a short little sword. And then as far as the printing, you can see that this, for your primary sub-dial, does have printed numerals all the way around. And I think those are a nice, and I'm going to completely kill this, the pronunciation, but like that baguette style for that as far as that numeral choice, which I think is a good font and it complements this. As far as the chaptering, as you look out on the perimeter there, you can see that printing does continue, and you do have, for your precision legibility, a chaptering running all the way around. You might notice when you go over to the sub-dial, not only does it have for your, the sub-dial, not only for your seconds does it have your hashes there, but then additionally you might have noticed that errant hash in the middle, or set of hashes, and that's actually intended to be a continuation of the minute and hour track as it goes through there. So that's an interesting touch. We'll come back to that. I'm not certain that I'm sold on that, but I'll have some feedback there shortly. As far as the bezel on this is a fixed construction, as we already saw there. It is relatively flush, so we'll just call it, for all intents and purposes, flush on the lip. However, you can see that this not only has polishing, so it changes up the texture and the finish there on the case that we'll look at, but additionally, the main thing you're going to notice is it does have that concavity onto it, so it's really like a ball milled cut all the way around, which I think is visually interesting, and I do appreciate, especially with the thickness of the overall watch, I think visually that slims it out a little bit and shrinks it down from the 40mm presence, which I think is welcome for this because it has a lot of dial presence, as we'll see. Shifting over to the case on this is actually somewhat reminiscent of a thicker version of the Supernatural, which we'll bring it in side by side next to. It's what I would describe as being a somewhat traditional looking case shape for that. You can see it is definitely on the thicker side. The case itself isn't terrible, and actually the total specs I don't think are terrible, particularly for a dive watch, but for a fixed watch of this style, it tends to wear definitely a bit thicker than the specs would denote. And most of that I think is owing to, when you look at the sandwich, relatively thick bezel and then a very thick case back as well. So the actual mid case is not the slimmest in the world by any means, but it's not overly thick there. As far as the finishing, you can see that this does have horizontal brushing, so that is running the length of the case there. And then additionally, though, it does have, to break things up, you have the polished accents. So you can see out in the lugs, you've got that little chamfer cut, and then of course with the bezel integration, so just breaking things up. And then even when you're looking at the profile, you do get a kiss of polishing on the actual case back itself that we'll check out here shortly. You can see the case profile is relatively flat, so certainly it does have downturn to the lugs, and obviously that's noticeable here. However, when you look at the thickness of the case back, that makes it wear kind of a little bit flat for the overall case. You can see it does sit fairly proud of the case back, and again, we'll come back to that. Part of the lugs I expect or suspect are owing to the crown integration, which, as far as the crown, that's one of the things I'm sure that you readily already noticed. At the 6 o'clock position is where you're going to find the crown, and it actually is situated and sandwiched in between some crown guards there as well. Do note on the production version, they are actually going to shrink down these crown guards, and that's for accessibility reasons. Though I do think visually that'll actually clean it up, give it a little more of a traditional look as well, so you don't have kind of that imbalance on the 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock side, or at least as noticeably so. As far as the crown itself, this is coming in at 5.8 millimeters. As you'd probably expect for this style, it is a push-pull design. I certainly would not want a screw down. That would be a bear to access. It is a traditional coin edge for that, but do note on the production version, they actually are going to sharpen the teeth, so that's going to add a little more purchase. I haven't found it really to be too bad, other than the reasons we'll talk about that are probably obvious. And then on the exterior, you can see that they do change up the texture and finish. And again, they have that, just like on the dial, with that Martin Design signature there. As far as the access that I was just alluding to a moment ago, with the straps and everything, if you don't take the strap off, it is a little bit finicky to grab a hold of. However, as you can see there, I didn't really have a problem with that. And then you can just move the hands back and forth. I haven't actually found it to be that bad, but they are, again, going to improve that with the changes to the crown as well as the crown guard. But really, in usage, for all the more you have to set the watch, it hasn't been that bad. So I really am not too disappointed in that as far as the change for it. And I think, again, it gives you something different. As far as the Caseback, the Caseback on this is going to carry through with a screw-in construction. So yeah, it's not the highest water resistance, but it does have easy accessibility in the good seal that you get with a screw-in construction. It has keyholes that are embedded all the way around there. One of the biggest things you're going to notice, though, is naturally the fact that this has a very expansive exhibition window on the back. So you can see there's plenty of real estate to showcase that movement, which is, as you can see, pretty nicely decorated. You have Geneva striping on the rotor, and then you have machine turning as well as some color accents with blue and otherwise across the actual movement itself. As far as with this finishing here, you can see on the exterior, you're going to be looking at brushing, and then on the far exterior, the actual lip there, as we already saw, it does have polishing for that as well. Shifting over to the bracelet. As I already indicated, there are two different bracelet options, there is an optional bracelet that we're looking at here. This is non-tapering, so you're going to be looking at 20 millimeters both at the lugs as well as down at the clasp. This is what I would call a 5-link construction. Well, it is a 5-link construction, but then it does have those splits that almost gives kind of like that 9 aesthetic there, or rather 7, I guess, aesthetic for that with the splits down the middle. As far as the overall layout with this, you can see that it is brushing, and then it does have the polish as far as the alternating there, which is a pretty classic and traditional look for that. This is retained with pins, so do be aware of that if you don't already have a tool. I'll, of course, have a kit link down in the video description, but these are traditional like cotter pins, so they are pretty easy to pop it in and out there, so didn't have any problems in getting this sized. As you can see, fits just fine on my 6.5-inch wrist, definitely on the longer side. The bracelet, do also note, does have quick release spring bars on the rear, so it is going to be easy to change that out. And then, of course, as I'm sure you already saw, it does not have fitted end links, which again, just in keeping with the style, I don't think that's really possible, at least in any way that I can readily visualize. The articulation on this is not too bad. It has a pretty good drape, relatively short links, which I think really lend directly to that, but it's also fairly freely articulating. So yes, it is definitely on the wider side, especially for smaller wrists, but this is not the most small wrist friendly watch to begin with, so I don't think that's going to be too much of a problem. As far as the retention, it is, or rather the closure, it is held together with a butterfly clasp, as you can see in the middle. That is full polish, and it's going to be traditional, milled kind of construction there. I have not had any issues with sizing, or did not have issues with sizing, again, because of the relatively short links, though it does not have half links. Shifting over to the strap, as you can see here, this really dramatically changes up the look of this design. The strap here is tapered from 20 millimeters at the lugs down to 18 millimeters at the buckle. So I do think that definitely slims it out, but then it just additionally, visually, it really dramatically changes the way that this looks. You're going to be looking at a canvas material or a sailcloth type material on the exterior. As you move down towards the holes, there is a pretty good range, though I'm on the closest hole for this on my 6.5-inch wrist, but again, I'm on the smaller side of what this watch, I think, permits. But around the holes, it does have a reinforcement liner there. It has matching stitching on this particular version, and then on the interior you're looking at what I believe is a leather type backing for this. It almost has like a suede feel, but it's not a real rough cut or texture for that. Additionally, this particular one does have, or this strap rather, does have quick release spring bars as well. So again, you're going to be able to change that out, whether you go with the bracelet or just want to put on a strap of your own choice. You do have options there. And then the buckle, this is a custom buckle here. It has kind of like that flare out on the exterior, brushing in the middle, signed, and then polish out on the outside. All right, so that should hopefully give you a much better feel for this model, but let's go ahead and round things out with some comps. So here it is next to, we've already talked about several times, this is the Martin Design, this is the Supernatural that I've talked about, and this was actually prototype here as well. So you can see here definitely a lot more visual presence to this, a lot more size to the overall watch, but you can see again, that unconventional sub-dial layout for it, so appreciate that. And then looking at here, this is next to another 40 millimeter watch. This is the Henry Archer Westerhoff. And you can see here, it definitely, I think, has, to me, it's hard to say. You're looking at light dial versus dark dial as far as overall case presence. I feel like this one seems chunkier and thicker, which it is. But this one, though, with the light dial does, I think, still have a lot of dial presence, if not as much case presence. And then here it is next to a Citizen. Brought this in for a couple reasons. It does have blued hardware on this one as well, though, again, in this lighting, it's oftentimes tough to see that pop. But you're going to be looking at similar on this particular combo with blued hardware against white, which I like. But this is a 40 millimeters, it's actually a JDM exclusive version here, but that gives you an idea of sizing next to a traditional. And then, of course, we saw a similar kind of bracelet design for that as well. All right, so now you should have a much better feel for this overall model, but let's go ahead and wrap things up with my personal view of the positives, some critiques, as well as the summary. First, for the positives, I've got to say, it is absolutely hypnotic watching these balance wheels. Something to me about this kind of open heart as opposed to just your traditional, something about those kind of competing balance wheels or those complementing, I guess, balance wheels, it really just sucks you in. It is such a cool look for it. It actually reminds me a lot of Skeletons, which I know open hearts always kind of are, but this one more so with being more expansive. The finishing on this, especially on the production version, should hopefully be pretty attractive. Right now, it definitely needs some cleanup, but again, that's something that they're aware of, but this is a very early prototype, so that is something they have said much better finishing on the final product. As far as the layout, just like with the Supernatural, this one I think is attractively done. It is obviously going to be an unconventional look to it, but I think it's very nicely laid out. I really like the blue pop. I'm a sucker for blue on white, so this would definitely be my particular choice given the option there. So I think that's a really fun combo there. As far as the legibility, surprisingly, despite the fact that this has a relatively small subdial and obviously a staggered layout, I found it to be surprisingly legible. I do have an asterisk with that because I'll come back to a couple pieces that I think they could improve on for legibility. But otherwise, do expect if your eyes aren't the best, then obviously it's going to be on the smaller side for it, but really have not had any problems with at-a-glance legibility. It's still a traditional layout on this particular one. The next piece I've already kind of alluded to, and that is just the unconventional nature of the design. It's something that I think has been present for most of Martin Design watches, and certainly was true of the Supernatural we just saw, but I really appreciate it. I love the fact that they're kind of going out of the box for it and just reinventing or reimagining some pieces instead of just putting out the same thing as everybody else. And then one thing we haven't talked about is the value. This one, once again, is an excellent value. It's going to be launching at $315. So assuming that that's the super early bird pricing and that's converted to US dollars, so give or take there. But that being said, assuming that they clean up the finishing and everything, like I fully expect that they will, as was the case with the production of the past watches. With that being the case, I think you're getting a lot of watch for $315 just for the unconventional design alone. But certainly there's a lot of other attributes to it as well. So what about the critiques, though? The first one is hard to really call a critique per se, but it is not small wrist friendly. That's definitely something that I think it's really pushing it for me, and in fact, I think is past my personal comfort zone on my 6.5 inch wrist, but that is something just to be aware of for it, particularly with not only the thickness, a lot of case presence, but the biggest thing is going to be that long lug to lug. They unfortunately have said they don't believe they can decrease the lug to lug because of this access. I do think they could probably shave off a millimeter, maybe 3 total, millimeter from each side or 3 total millimeters. Obviously I'm not an engineer here. That might cause problems with the bracelet, but with the strap at least, this does seem to have sufficient clearance, and I absolutely think it'd be worth making a little tighter there just to make this a little more wrist versatile. This is definitely on the long side, especially with the flatter profile for me. So it's just something to be aware of. The hand length, as I said, it would come back to with respect to legibility. I would have liked to have seen if they actually shrunk the hour hand a little bit and brought it just right at that inner lip. It's close to it now, so just a tiny shaving, and then actually increased the minute hand there. Not only do I think that that would help with legibility, the biggest thing is I think that that would make it easier to distinguish between these. The hands, with being as small as they are a different length, and you can readily see that when you start actually looking more closely. But for quick at a glance, it is easy to get a little bit confused as to which is which, especially when they're not right next to each other, so you can't see the hand length difference. And then as far as the subdial, that indicator that I said I would come back to, I personally think that I would have preferred the cleaner aesthetic, lose that little bit of legibility, but I would have preferred the cleaner aesthetic if they didn't carry that through. With them carrying it through, I think it needs a little more curvature to it. So if they're going to keep that, I think they need to readjust the angle just to complete the circle. At least to my eye, it looks just a little bit off, a little bit flat. And then finally, the thickness. As I already talked about earlier, it is definitely on the chunky side. Certainly, I think most of that is in this Caseback. That's the biggest area where I really hope, even if they had to go over to a manual wind movement, though I don't know if they have an option for that or not with this configuration. But that being said, anything they could do to shrink that down, I think it would make it wear so much nicer on the wrist. It would wear not only less chunky overall, but it would have less of that kind of flying saucer effect. So that's everything that I had as far as the positives and the negatives. Where does that leave us? Just like we saw with the Supernatural, this is absolutely one that isn't going to be for everybody, nor is it, in my opinion, an everyday piece. But to me, that's okay. I have a lot of different watches out there, as I'm sure most of you do, and I appreciate ones that stand out a little more from the rest of the ones in the collection. So you got to appreciate the creativity, even if this particular one isn't for you. So hopefully this is giving you a much better feel as to if this is one you're interested in or not. If you did like it, as always, tap that like button, smash that subscribe button if you haven't already done so, and then finally, and most importantly, drop me a comment. Let me know what you think. What do you think of the sizing? What do you think of the style? All that kind of good stuff. Thanks for watching.